All right, I need you to stop what you're doing and pay attention to what I'm about to tell you. Because what happened yesterday in Geneva isn't just another diplomatic spat. It isn't another bureaucratic shuffle in the endless game that world powers play with each other. This is the moment when the entire architecture of nuclear peace, the framework that's kept us from annihilating ourselves for over half a century, just collapsed. And nobody in Washington seems particularly worried about it. If you care about whether your children grow up in a world that's safe from nuclear war, subscribe to this channel right now. Turn on notifications. Because what's unfolding over the next few weeks will determine whether we slide into a new arms race or whether anybody with power actually has the courage to stop it. Here's what we know. Yesterday, February 6th, at a disarmament conference in Geneva, Switzerland, Undersecretary of State Thomas DiNanno stood up and dropped a bombshell that should have been leading every news broadcast in America. Instead, you probably didn't hear about it. Instead, you got more coverage about whatever celebrity broke up with their boyfriend. DiNanno looked the world's diplomats in the eye and said this, and I'm quoting directly, "I can reveal that the U.S. government is aware that China has conducted nuclear explosive tests, including preparing for tests with designated yields in the hundreds of tons." Let me say that again so it lands. The United States just accused China of conducting secret nuclear weapons tests, tests that violate international commitments, tests that China deliberately tried to hide from the world. And when did this happen? June 22nd, 2020, almost 6 years ago. Which raises a pretty obvious question that nobody in our media seems interested in asking. If we knew about this in 2020, why are we only hearing about it now? What else do they know that they're not telling us? Now, before we go any further, let me explain why this matters. Because context is everything. And the context here is genuinely terrifying. The day before DiNanno made this revelation, another event occurred that got slightly more coverage. The New START treaty between the United States and Russia expired, just ended. No replacement, no extension, nothing. For those of you who aren't arms control nerds, let me explain what that means. New START was the last remaining agreement limiting nuclear weapons between the world's two largest nuclear powers. It capped deployed strategic nuclear warheads at 1,550 on each side. It required inspections. It required transparency. It required both nations to actually tell each other what they were doing with their missiles. That treaty expired at midnight on February 5th. And for the first time since 1972, there are zero binding constraints on American and Russian nuclear arsenals. None. We are now operating in a world where the two countries that possess nearly 90% of all nuclear weapons on Earth have no legal obligation to limit how many they build, how many they deploy, or where they point them. Think about that. The last guardrail just came off. And the timing of this accusation against China, coming exactly one day after that treaty expired, that's not coincidence, that's strategy. So let me ask you this. Why now? Why did the Trump administration choose this exact moment to reveal that China conducted secret nuclear tests 6 years ago? What changed? The answer is simple, and it's cynical, and it tells you everything you need to know about how this game is actually played. The Trump administration wants a new nuclear treaty, but they don't want the same old bilateral deal with Russia. They want something bigger. They want China at the table. They want a trilateral agreement. US, Russia, and China, all bound by the same limits. China has refused repeatedly. Beijing's position has been consistent. We only have 600 warheads. Russia and the US each have over 4,000. It's not fair or reasonable to ask us to negotiate when our arsenal is a tiny fraction of yours. That's actually a pretty compelling argument. If you're at a poker table and two players each have $10,000 in chips and you've got $600, are you going to agree to a deal where everyone limits themselves to the same amount? Of course not. You'd lose your only advantage. But the Trump administration doesn't care about fairness, they care about leverage. So what do you do when someone won't come to the negotiating table? You embarrass them publicly. You accuse them of cheating. You drag their secret violations into the international spotlight and force them to defend themselves. That's what happened in Geneva. This wasn't about revealing new intelligence. This was about creating pressure. This was about boxing China into a corner where they either come to the table or look like rogue actors who can't be trusted. And here's the thing that should terrify you. It's working. Let me walk you through exactly how China allegedly pulled this off, because the technical details matter here. Donano claimed that China used something called decoupling to hide their nuclear test. For those who aren't familiar, decoupling is a method where you dig a massive underground cavern, detonate your nuclear device inside that cavern, and the empty space absorbs much of the seismic energy. This makes the explosion harder to detect through the global monitoring systems that track nuclear tests. It's sophisticated, it's deliberate, and it only works if you're trying to hide something. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, the CTBTO, the international body whose entire job is to monitor for nuclear weapons tests worldwide, they issued a statement yesterday, and they said their monitoring system did not detect any event consistent with the characteristics of a nuclear weapon test explosion on June 22, 2020. Read that carefully. The organization whose job it is to detect nuclear tests says they didn't detect anything. So either the United States has intelligence capabilities so advanced that they can detect things the entire international monitoring apparatus cannot, or they're making this up. Or, and this is the most unsettling possibility, China's decoupling technique worked so well that even our systems barely caught it, and we're only revealing it now for political purposes. China's response was predictable. Their ambassador on disarmament, Shen Jian, didn't directly address the accusation. Instead, he said Beijing firmly opposes such false narratives and accused the United States of hyping up the so-called China nuclear threat. Notice what he didn't say. He didn't say, we didn't do it. He didn't say, this is a lie. He said, false narratives. That's diplomatic speak for, we're not engaging with this. And then he blamed America. The U.S. is the culprit for the aggravation of the arms race. Here's the uncomfortable truth. He's not entirely wrong. The United States is the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons in war, twice. We have conducted over 1,000 nuclear test explosions since 1945. Russia has conducted over 700. China has conducted around 45. So when China points out that we're lecturing them about testing while we've tested more nuclear weapons than any nation in history, that's not propaganda, that's just math. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Last fall, President Trump ordered the Pentagon to prepare to resume nuclear testing on an equal basis. That's a direct quote. He said we should start testing our nuclear weapons again because Russia and China are allegedly violating their testing moratoria. You see the circular logic here? We accuse them of secret testing, so we say we're going to start testing openly, which gives them justification to test more, which gives us justification to test more. Round and round it goes. This is how arms races start, not with some grand strategy, not with careful deliberation, with escalation, with tit for tat, with nations looking at each other and saying, if they're doing it, we're doing it too. Now let me tell you why the timing of all this is genuinely dangerous. The New START treaty expired 2 days ago. There is no replacement. The Trump administration says they want a new deal, but they want it to include China. China says they won't negotiate. Russia says they'll participate if Britain and France join too. Britain and France say, absolutely not. In the meantime, what happens? Nothing. No limits, no inspections, no transparency. Just 3 nuclear superpowers, each expanding their arsenals, each watching the others with suspicion, each preparing for a world where the old rules no longer apply. Secretary of State Marco Rubio put it bluntly in a statement this week. Russia and China should not expect the United States to stand still while they shirk their obligations and expand their nuclear forces. We will maintain a robust, credible, and modernized nuclear deterrent. Translation, we're building more nukes, and we're not apologizing for it. China is increasing its nuclear stockpile by about 100 warheads per year. They're on pace to have over 1,000 by 2030. Russia is modernizing its entire arsenal, developing hypersonic missiles that can evade our defenses. And the United States is planning to spend over $1.5 trillion over the next 3 decades upgrading every component of our nuclear triad. This is what an arms race looks like in its early stages. And nobody, absolutely nobody in a position of authority seems capable of hitting the brakes. Here's what really gets me, and this is where I sound like Tucker, because this is the kind of thing that drives him crazy. We're watching the entire framework of nuclear arms control collapse in real time. Treaties that took decades to negotiate are expiring without replacement. Accusations are flying. Testing may resume for the first time in over a quarter century. And what's the response from our political class? Silence, indifference, business as usual. You know what was trending on Twitter yesterday when this news broke? A celebrity feud, a TikTok dance, some nonsense about a reality TV show. The news that we just accused China of conducting secret nuclear tests and that the last nuclear treaty between superpowers has expired? Barely registered. And that tells you everything you need to know about how disconnected our media, our politicians, our entire elite class is from the actual threats facing this country. I'm not saying we should panic, but we should be paying attention. We should be asking questions. We should be demanding that the people who run this country explain what their plan is for preventing a new nuclear arms race. Because here's the thing about nuclear weapons. You don't get a do-over. You don't get to say, oops, we miscalculated. Once the missiles fly, that's it. Game over for everyone. Let me give you some context that nobody else is talking about. On January 27th, the doomsday clock moved to 85 seconds to midnight. That's the closest it's been to catastrophe in the entire history of the clock. They cited 2 reasons: the war in Ukraine and the breakdown of nuclear arms control. And here we are 10 days later, and the situation has gotten worse. The last treaty expired. China's been accused of secret testing. The United States is preparing to resume its own testing. Russia is threatening, quote, decisive countermeasures if its national security is threatened. You want to know what 85 seconds to midnight looks like? This is it. This is what the collapse of international order looks like in slow motion. And the most frustrating part? It's completely preventable. Russia offered last September to continue abiding by New START's limits for another year if the U.S. agreed to do the same. No formal treaty, just mutual restraint while we negotiate something new. Trump's response? He called it, quote, a badly negotiated deal, and said if it expires, it expires. We'll do better. Okay, great. So where's the better deal? It's been 5 months. Where's the negotiation? Where's the new treaty? It doesn't exist. And security analysts say even if negotiations started tomorrow, it would take years to hammer out a new agreement. Years during which all 3 nuclear superpowers are unconstrained. Years during which worst-case assumptions and mutual suspicion drive each nation to build more, deploy more, test more. Here's what nobody in Washington wants to admit. And this is the part where I sound most like Tucker. The Trump administration doesn't actually want arms control. They want dominance. They're not interested in limiting nuclear weapons. They're interested in ensuring that America has more, better, and faster nukes than anyone else. And if that means walking away from treaties, if that means letting old agreements expire, if that means accusing China of violations to justify our own buildup, so be it. This is the logic of the Cold War: mutually assured destruction, peace through strength, deterrence. And you know what? Maybe they're right. Maybe in a world with multiple nuclear powers, the only way to stay safe is to be stronger than everyone else. Maybe arms control is a relic of a simpler time when there were only 2 superpowers and they could sit down and hash out deals. But if that's the strategy, they should say so. They should be honest about it. They should stand up and tell the American people, we're not limiting our nuclear weapons anymore. We're building as many as we need to stay ahead of Russia and China. And if that triggers an arms race, that's a risk we're willing to take. Instead, we get these vague statements about modernization and deterrence and credible nuclear capabilities. We get accusations against China 6 years after the fact. We get treaties expiring without explanation or replacement. We get managed chaos. And that's more dangerous than either arms control or open competition. because at least in those scenarios, everyone knows where they stand. Let me connect some dots that are genuinely alarming. In the last 6 months, we've seen several developments that all point in the same direction. North Korea resumed missile testing. They launched what appears to be a new solid-fuel ICBM capable of reaching the U.S. mainland. Iran announced they're enriching uranium to 60%, just steps away from weapons-grade material. India and Pakistan both conducted missile tests in contested regions. Russia deployed tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus for the first time. And now we learn China conducted secret nuclear tests and is expanding its arsenal faster than any country in the world. You're watching nuclear proliferation accelerate across multiple fronts simultaneously. And the response from the international community? Strongly worded statements, diplomatic protests, calls for dialogue that go nowhere. This is what happens when the enforcement mechanisms break down, when treaties expire, when the major powers stop cooperating and start competing. And here's the nightmare scenario that keeps arms control experts awake at night. It's not that Russia or China or the US deliberately starts a nuclear war. It's that one of the smaller nuclear powers, one of the regional rivals, gets into a conflict that escalates. And then the major powers get drawn in. And suddenly you've got a situation where miscalculation, where accidents, where the fog of war leads to decisions that cannot be undone. Smash that like button right now if you understand the stakes of what we're discussing. This isn't hypothetical. This isn't some academic exercise. This is the world we're living in right now. Let me tell you what happens next, because the next few months are critical. In April and May, there's a review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in New York. That's the 1968 agreement where nuclear weapons states promised to work toward disarmament in exchange for non-nuclear states agreeing not to develop weapons. Russia, the United States, and China will all have to stand up and explain what progress they've made on disarmament. And the answer is going to be none. In fact, the opposite. They've all expanded their arsenals. They've all violated the spirit, if not the letter, of their commitments. That conference is going to be a disaster. Non-nuclear states are going to revolt. They're going to point out correctly that the major powers have no intention of disarming, that the entire NPT framework is a sham, that the nuclear powers lecture everyone else about proliferation while they build more weapons themselves. And when that conference collapses, when that framework breaks down, what incentive does any country have to refrain from developing nuclear weapons? Japan, which has been considering its nuclear options for years, could make a decision. South Korea, which feels increasingly vulnerable to North Korea and China, could pursue weapons. Poland, terrified of Russia, could demand NATO nuclear sharing or develop its own program. Saudi Arabia could buy weapons from Pakistan. You see how quickly this spirals? Once the norm against proliferation breaks, once the major powers stop setting an example, the entire system unravels. Now, some of you are probably thinking, this sounds like fear-mongering. Nuclear war hasn't happened in 80 years. Why would it happen now? And that's a fair question. So let me give you Tucker's answer. For 80 years, we've been lucky. We came close during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We came close during the Soviet war scare of 1983. We came close during the Kashmir crisis in 2002. But we didn't cross the line. Why? Because there were guardrails. Because there were treaties that required communication. Because there were inspection regimes that built trust. Because leaders on both sides understood that the consequences of miscalculation were so catastrophic that extreme caution was required. Those guardrails are gone now. The treaties are expiring. The inspection regimes are suspended. The communication channels are frayed. The trust is evaporated. And we're adding new players to the game. China wasn't a major nuclear power during the Cold War. North Korea didn't have ICBMs. Iran wasn't on the threshold of weapons capability. The game has gotten more complicated. More players, more weapons, more flashpoints, and fewer rules. That's not fear-mongering. That's math. Here's what I want you to understand about how these accusations against China actually work in practice. Deneno didn't just accuse China of one test in 2020. He said they've been preparing for tests with designated yields in the hundreds of tons. Present tense, ongoing. That suggests the U.S. intelligence community has evidence of an active, systematic program of nuclear testing by China. Not a one-off, a pattern. And if that's true, and if China's decoupling techniques are sophisticated enough to evade international monitoring, then we have to assume they're conducting multiple tests that we don't know about, which means their actual weapons capability could be significantly more advanced than we think, which means our deterrent calculations, our war planning, our strategic assumptions, all of that could be based on faulty intelligence. And that's how wars start, not because anyone wants them, but because one side miscalculates what the other side is capable of, because intelligence failures lead to strategic mistakes, because assumptions turn out to be wrong. The fog of war is bad enough in conventional conflicts. In nuclear strategy, where split-second decisions determine the survival of civilization, the margin for error is zero. Subscribe to this channel right now if you haven't already. Turn on notifications, because this story is going to develop rapidly and you need to be informed. Here's what's coming in the next few weeks. Trump is scheduled to visit Beijing in April. That was announced this week. He and President Xi are going to have, quote, very positive talks about trade and security issues. You want to bet nuclear weapons come up? You want to bet Trump uses this accusation as leverage to try to force China to the negotiating table? And if China refuses, what then? Does Trump follow through on his threat to resume U.S. nuclear testing? Does he authorize the Pentagon to conduct the first American nuclear weapons test since 1992? Because if he does, that's it. The entire international norm against testing collapses. Russia will test. China will test. Others will follow. And we'll be right back in the 1950s and 60s, when nuclear tests were regular occurrences, when fallout contaminated the atmosphere, when every test was a demonstration of power and a provocation to the other side. Is that the world you want your kids to grow up in? Let me give you the view that nobody else is providing. This isn't about whether nuclear weapons are good or bad. They exist. That's reality. We can't uninvent them. The question is how we manage them, how we prevent their use, how we ensure that the nations that possess them operate with restraint and transparency. For half a century, we did that through treaties, through dialogue, through verification, through a shared understanding that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. That consensus is breaking down, not because anyone wants nuclear war, but because the great powers no longer trust each other, because domestic politics in all three countries reward strength over compromise, because the incentives all point toward building more weapons, not fewer. And once that arms race begins, it has its own logic. Each side builds more to stay ahead, which makes the other side feel less secure, which drives them to build even more, round and round, faster and faster, until someone makes a mistake. Here's my challenge to anyone in the Trump administration who might be watching this. Explain the plan. If you're not extending New START, fine. If you think it's a bad deal, okay. If you want China at the table, I understand the logic. But what's the plan to get there? How do you convince China to negotiate when their entire strategic calculation is based on being the smaller power? How do you prevent Russia from expanding its arsenal in the meantime? How do you ensure that other countries don't take this as a signal to start their own nuclear programs? I want specifics, not vague promises about modernization and deterrence. I want to know what steps you're taking to prevent the arms race that every expert says is coming. Because right now, it looks like there is no plan. It looks like you're making it up as you go. Accusing China of violations from 6 years ago, letting treaties expire without replacement, threatening to resume testing without explaining what that accomplishes. That's not strategy, that's chaos. Here's what keeps me up at night. We're watching multiple crises converge. The war in Ukraine, tensions in the Taiwan Strait, instability in the Middle East, nuclear proliferation in North Korea and Iran, the breakdown of arms control between major powers. Any one of these could spin out of control. But what happens when they intersect? What happens when Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine? When China decides the moment is right to move on Taiwan? When Iran announces they've achieved weapons capability? Do we respond? Do we intervene? Do we escalate? And at what point does someone, somewhere, make the decision that the use of nuclear weapons is the least bad option? I'm not saying this is inevitable, but I am saying the risk is higher now than it's been in decades, and the mechanisms we built to manage that risk are failing. Drop a comment right now. Tell me what you think. Am I overstating the danger, or am I being too cautious? Because here's what I genuinely believe. The American people deserve to know what's being done in their name. They deserve to understand the risks. They deserve to hear an honest debate about nuclear strategy, about arms control, about whether we're making the world safer or more dangerous. That debate isn't happening. Instead, we get accusations against China dropped casually at a conference in Geneva. We get treaties expiring with a shrug. We get presidential tweets about badly negotiated deals. We deserve better. The world deserves better. Let me leave you with this final thought. There's a reason the doomsday clock is at 85 seconds to midnight. The people who set that clock, they're not alarmists. They're nuclear scientists, arms control experts, people who understand the technology, the strategy, the history. And they're telling us we're closer to catastrophe than we've ever been. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe the guardrails will hold even without formal treaties. Maybe deterrence will work even as arsenals expand. Maybe this all works out fine. But what if they're right? What if the breakdown of arms control really does lead to an arms race? What if that arms race really does increase the risk of miscalculation? What if miscalculation really does lead to nuclear use? At what point do we decide that's a risk not worth taking? The next few months will answer that question. Will Trump actually visit Beijing and negotiate a new treaty? Will China agree to participate? Will Russia honor its commitment to act responsibly and with restraint, even without legal obligations? Or will we continue down this path? More accusations, more testing, more weapons, more tension. I'll be here covering every development, every statement, every provocation, every missed opportunity. Subscribe, turn on notifications. Share this with everyone you know. Because this is the story that actually matters, not the theater, not the distractions. The question of whether we're going to prevent nuclear war or stumble our way into it. That's what's at stake. That's what we're watching unfold in real time. Stay informed, stay engaged, and for God's sake, demand better from the people who are making these decisions. I'll see you in the next update.